Welcome to The History of the World, a new show where Joan
Hoi!
and I explore the history of video games. The question comes, where to begin? And we could honestly start in a billion places, depending on how pedantic you want to be. Now, if you ask your average gamer where games started, it might go a little something like this. Hey buddy. Hey, got a question for you.
What do you want, Travis?
What would you say was the first video game ever made?
The first what?
The first video game ever made. Simple question here.
Pong, I think.
Pong! But there's such a deep, rich history well before Pong.
Did you wake me up to tell me something was before Pong?
Maybe?
Do you want to rethink that?
No?
We look to explore where we came from, where we've been, and where our cultural milestones stand in the history of time.
It's been a long road, with several crashes and missteps along the way. We're not just talking about the Virtual Boy either.
So how did we get from the bored man working with radar scopes all the way to the consoles and PC games of the modern age? Let's take a long step back, shall we, and consider the history of the world.
The question begins, where does one start? The history of gaming itself is older than one could even consider.
Well, you could start with cards and games of chance. They certainly have their place in history, a long-standing one in fact. Or collectible cards. The origin of even big companies like Nintendo had their place too.
Nothing comes from nothing after all, except possibly the Ouya, and cheap shots at the Ouya.
We're going to start with the concept of engineering hobbyist and the penny arcade.
Since the beginning of time, people have been bored. This has mostly been a good thing, as boredom brings about invention and innovation. It also brings trolls, sure, but that's for our next series, The History of the Internet. Which may never happen, thanks to legal proceedings with Al Gore.
A form of billiards called bagatelle was sort of the great-grandfather of video games. Players used a cue to shoot balls up a sloped table which had 9 cups. Eventually, the cue was replaced with something called a plunger, and the game changed into the first form of pinball. Arcade designers of the early 1930s were looking to liven up the relatively mundane game of pinball, which was a classically spring-loaded game. David Gottlieb created another ancestor, Baffle Ball, which, while not having electronics, flippers, or bumpers, had players using a plunger to launch balls into a sloped table. This table, in turn, was studded with pins circulating 8 holes. The game was a huge success, shipping as many as 400 cabinets in a day. In 1932, Gottlieb's major competitor, Harry Williams, made pinball more difficult by designing the tilt mechanisms in machines. When the cabinet was tilted, the game was over. And in 1933, Williams created Contact, the first electric pinball machine. Kinda. Electronic-powered scoring pockets, or contact holes, knocked the ball back into the play area to allow players to continue to score points. Electronics and transistor-activated bumpers were eventually added to pinball as well, adding to the robustness of the game.
It was with these games in mind that the scientists and the hobbyists of the day, looking to see the limits of the technology they were creating, began experimenting with the electronics they had on hand. In the late 1950s, early 1960s, silicon chips began to replace transistors, resulting in faster, smaller, and more powerful computers. Computer readout screens began making an appearance around this time too, as early computers didn't have monitors. This led to the beginning of what was known as the video game. Most of these early video games were relatively banal, hitting a button in time with sequence on screen.
This brings us to what could be considered the first video game. Keep in mind now that most early games are relics of a bygone era, so while we will be making our own videos for future games, we'll be relying on others with actual access to the games for the proto-era of gaming.
In 1958, physicist William Higginbotham created what could arguably be called the first video game. Using an oscilloscope and some handmade aluminum controllers, he created the very basic mechanics for games in a few hours, though it took several weeks for the machine to be functionally useful.
The game was put on display at the Brookhaven National Laboratory, something otherwise considered quite the dull experience. The exhibit was on display for several years, eventually getting an upgrade that simulated the effects of gravity on the ball. The game included a sound that the game made when the ball was hit, giving the users feedback to their play.
Though it was popular, it was ultimately an exhibit to display the capacity of the early machines, and despite attempts to market, was ultimately dismantled, though it was reconstructed for its 50th anniversary.
In 1962, the game Space War was developed in MIT labs. Considered the first hack in known creation, it far more resembled a radar system than a video game.
While the game is fairly simple by modern conventions, it is actually fairly complex in design, even by 70s arcade cabinet game standards.
The gameplay was likely what encouraged future games such as Asteroids. Two players could fly spaceships about an empty field and attempt to shoot each other. What made the game interesting was at the center of the playing field existed a sun with a gravity field. You could use the sun's gravity to alter the trajectory of your shot's course and even your ship's course.
Touching the sun, of course, destroyed your vehicle. While later iterations would include a scoring system, points would have to be manually tracked.
Space War became a fairly popular game amongst the colleges of the time. Colleges were one of the few places with the equipment to run it, and the number of hobbyists interested in modifying or hacking their existing equipment. Not bad for the world's first ROM hack in history.
Enter Sega, initially called Service Games, to the scene. Video games were primarily the domain of hobbyists and laboratories wanting to show off their abilities. Sega would be the first to show that these video games were financially viable.
Already having a long history of creating Midway attractions such as pinball and jukeboxes, Sega was steadily moving far away from their American military roots. Basic coin-operated games with video monitors were a natural progression for them.
The popular arcade game Periscope was released in 1966. It was a basic light gun shooter similar to Duck Hunt, which wouldn't be around until 1984. Sega's early games used basic microprocessors to process gameplay and, mostly, used moving parts to convey movement rather than on-screen direction and visuals. However, it was quite the hit, and a huge novelty of the time.
The games had so many moving parts they required the then unheard of amount of a quarter to play, which became the industry standards for years to come.
All of these things, however, had a few requirements. Complex machinery and non-standard equipment that simply do not exist in large quantities. In the case of Space Wars, existing equipment had to be hacked for use.
Sega's Midway games still required moving parts and very little on the end of electronic display, a large part of the consideration of what we would today call a video game.
And that leads us up to our next episode, where video games hit the home market with a little brown box.
Stay tuned.
Wake up all alone at night, reaching for the side of bed. There ain't no one there at all, so I reach for the bottle instead. Well, I'm alone again. Well, I'm alone at last. Well, I'm alone again. Well, I'm alone.